I know you're wanting to listen to this episode of the Comics Alternative, but before we get started, let me just remind you guys that it's the gift-giving season. Now, that may be obvious, but one of the things that's not so obvious is that you can get all of your stuff and help out the podcast by going to comicsalternative.com/Amazon. Click through on our Amazon banner that you find on that page, and whatever you get during that visit to Amazon, the Comics Alternative will get a few cents kickback. So, whether it be Hanukkah, Christmas, Kwanzaa, or Festivus, get your gifts through our Amazon Associate link. It's a smart way to get your books, and you'll be helping out the podcast. And isn't that what the holiday season is all about? Helping our podcast. This is the Comics Alternative Webcomics, reviews of Grass of Parnassus, Lavender Jack, and Take the A-Train. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative Webcomics. I'm Derek.
And I'm Sean, and you're listening to two guys with advanced degrees talking about webcomics.
That's right. And on the November, albeit late, webcomics episode, Sean and I are going to look at two current ongoing webcomics and one already completed. We're going to begin with Stuart and Catherine Immonen's Grass of Parnassus. After that, we're going to look at Dan Schkade's Lavender Jack. And then we're going to wrap up with a completed webcomic by Deanand Z Akhmetova, Take the A-Train. But before we get to that discussion, we want to let all of you know that this episode of the Comics Alternative Webcomics is brought to you by those wonderful folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts can be from anywhere from 20 to 35% off of the cover price. And every month, you're going to find some incredible specials. Sometimes those specials could be as much as 45% off the cover price. Sometimes 50% off cover, but occasionally you can find discounts that are even more impressive than that.
And we'd be remiss if we did not point out their sister company, mydigitalcomics.com. That's where you can pick up a lot of your favorite digital comics. We're assuming that because you're listening to a podcast on webcomics that you might have an interest there, as well as the Dead Tree version of your favorite comics. At mydigitalcomics.com, you can pick up a lot of your favorite publishers, Action Lab, Boom Studios, Image Comics, etc., etc. Lots of great stuff there. They all have CBZ and PDF formats, which means that everything is, or virtually everything is, DRM free for you, which definite plus when it comes to digital comics. So, mydigitalcomics.com if you're interested in looking at your stuff on a computer screen as opposed to holding a piece of dead paper in your hands.
That's right. You know, whether you like your comics in digital form or in hard copy, you really can't go wrong with Discount Comic Book Service and its sister company, mydigitalcomics.com. Go to dcbservice.com for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your titles there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that Sean and Derek sent you. Oh, Sean, well, this is the November webcomics episode. However, it's coming out the first week of December, so we're a little late.
Just a bit.
We missed the deadline by a few days. And that's mostly on me. You know, as I've mentioned on other podcast episodes, you know, I've had some family things go on, and that's kind of gotten in the way. But we wanted to make sure that we did get the November show, the webcomic show, up and out ASAP. And we will be back in December for the December show. So I guess for the month of December, our listeners, our fans who enjoy webcomics get a double shot.
Yeah, and what we usually do, too, is we also try and pull in some holiday-themed. We haven't talked about our December show yet, but we usually try and bring in some holiday-themed webcomics to take a look at. So like I said, we haven't talked about what we're going to be doing for the next show, but I'm sure it's at least a little bit more thematically interesting in that sense. But
yeah. I would hope so. I know that we did that last year. In fact, last year was the first time since we've been doing the webcomics series that we actually, for December, looked at Christmas oriented, for the most part, webcomics. Although I remember it being a little difficult finding Christmas related webcomics, and so
yeah,
we'll see what we can come up with this year. So maybe only part of it will be holiday themed, but we'll do our best.
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe we might spread it out to winter generally or something like that. That might be a way to go.
Okay, well, let's go ahead and start discussing the webcomics that we have for quote-unquote November. And we're going to start with a really interesting webcomic by actually two really important creators within comics, and now they're doing this webcomic, and that is Stuart and Catherine Emmenen. And this webcomic is called Grass of Parnassus. Now, one of the things that really marks this as very notable is the fact that the Emmenens are doing this, and they do great work.
Absolutely.
You really can't go wrong with anything that they do. Even if you don't like the story, you gotta love the art. It's just incredible. But I think another thing that makes this notable, and correct me if I'm wrong, this is the first time, Sean, that you and I have looked at a webcomic on Instagram.
I believe so. Yes. Yeah. It's certainly not the first webcomic delivered through Instagram, but the first one we've looked at.
Right. And we've looked at webcomics that are on other social networking sites. I guess technically, depending on your definition, Instagram may not be a social networking site because it's primarily an app and not really anything you can do in terms of posting through a web browser without a third-party software program. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. But yeah, I think this is the first time we've looked at a webcomic on Instagram. And I think it's a curious platform. Maybe before we discuss the webcomic proper, let's talk about the Emmenen's choice of platform. What do you think about comics on Instagram?
I don't think generally it's a good platform for webcomics. And I know, there was certainly some confusion on the proper reading assortment, reading order on things. There were a lot of the panels that, you and I talked before we started recording, and there were a lot of panels that you flat out missed because the UI isn't really conducive to graphic storytelling. It tends to be a little bit more conducive to single image, or I don't want to say story is the wrong word, but a small collection of images that you don't need to necessarily see all of them, but look at here's an album of our the dinner that we had. Here's the entree and the appetizer and the desserts and whatever. And there's 3 or 4 photos, and you don't really need to look at all of them. But if you do see all of them there, that's great. I don't know that it's especially conducive to webcomics. It almost works backwards in that sense, because in the first place, when you're presented with the the opening screen, if you will, it puts everything in reverse order. And to a degree, a lot of webcomics do that. They always put the latest comic first. But you don't typically see all of them at the same time in reverse order like that, right? You see, here's the latest comic, or if you want to go back to the beginning, you go all the way to the back, or if you go to their archives, then they'll list them oldest to newest. Whereas here, the only option is latest first, and then the newest one first, and then going to the oldest. And then once you're in that and you're looking at any given panel, then you have to click forward to get to the next panel, but then essentially kind of click backwards to get to the next page.
Right.
So it's kind of it strikes me as kind of a clunky UI for delivery of webcomics. That's not that obviously does not speak to the content at all, but the delivery mechanism, I think, is not ideal for a webcomics format in general.
Yeah. Now, I mean, I agree with everything you've said, and I'm trying to think, what would be some of the advantages of posting a webcomic on Instagram or maybe other social networking sites, or at least social media sites, broadly speaking, would be a better way of describing it or defining it. What are some of the benefits of that? And one I think really stands out, and tell me if you think I'm off base here. The vast majority of webcomics, those that we've discussed, but the ones that are out there, are for all practical purposes blogs. I mean, the structure of a webcomic is in essence the same structure as a blog. It's just a webcomic, right? So instead of text, you have primarily images, illustrations. And there are ways of pushing that out. So, for instance, you post something on your site, blog, the webcomic, and then you maybe use social media to get the word out that you got maybe even email, if you have an email list, to say, hey, the latest installment of this webcomic is out. Check it out. People could also set up RSS feeds to where if someone subscribes to the RSS feed for the webcomic, then they'll be alerted that a new installment has just been released. Yeah. I don't know. I mean, personally, I don't subscribe via RSS to any webcomics. Do you?
Oh yeah, I've been doing that for several years.
Yeah, and I think that's useful. I just don't. I just haven't gotten around to it really. But one of the benefits, though, of using something like Instagram is that it's kind of like Twitter, right? You have so many followers, and so when you post something, those who follow you get that information. So whereas with most webcomics that are set up like a blog, it's like individuals need to go to the site in order to, whether they subscribe or not via RSS, they have to come to the site to see things. When you have, let's say, a webcomic on Instagram, then every new installment is pushed out. And so people, when they open their device, when they open Instagram, then if they follow the Eminence, they're going to see this, right? So it comes to them instead of them having to go to the site.
Yeah, but there's some interesting twists in how that works, I think, as well. One is that, I don't know if you caught this or not, the Eminence have set up a separate account for Grass of Parnassus, separate from the Stuart Eminem or Catherine Eminem accounts. You've got a Grass of Parnassus account. Now they could set it up, and I honestly have not checked this, so that if you're following either one of them, that it's cross-posted. But if you want to get that update, you still have to go to and subscribe to Grass of Parnassus as its own account. And the other challenge to that is that if you're just looking through your Instagram feed, the latest updates that they're posting are going to get mixed in with everything else that you're following. So if you're following some guy who's doing, food reviews, or somebody who's doing tutorials on makeup or what have you, that's all going to get mixed in together in your Instagram feed, which for, narrative storytelling, that can be a little disruptive, I think. I haven't tried that myself, but I can't see that working particularly well in a reading experience, right? You're going through trying to read, here's the latest updates to the story, but then the next thing you see is, here's a makeup tutorial or, whatever. It's almost as if, it's almost as if you're watching a television program with, the requisite TV commercials interspersed, but the length of time of storytelling for the show versus commercials is switched. So it's almost like, you've got 10 minutes of commercials and then 30 seconds of story, and then 10 minutes of commercials and 30 seconds of story kind of thing.
Yeah.
At least given the frequency with which the Imminents have been posting this. I'm presume if you were super fast and chucking updates out left, right, and sideways, you could beef that up. But I think that'd be hard. You'd be hard pressed as a set of creators, no matter how talented, to do that on any level that wouldn't be interrupted frequently, I would think.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's a good point. Okay. Well, let's, we've talked about the platform, in which, is a little unusual. Do you think it works ultimately?
The story or
the story via the platform delivered through Instagram. I mean, do you think, even though it may be a little wonky, you didn't use the word wonky, but I mean, it's a
good word there.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there are some issues with Instagram as a way to publish a webcomic, as we've discussed. But do you think, bottom line, overall, that it works for what they're doing?
I think it works primarily because it's Catherine and Stuart Immonen. I think any less talented of creator would have a hard time pulling this off. And I say that for two reasons. One is, for someone like me who's not a big Instagram user in the first place, they both have a long enough history that I'm willing to try and figure out this different and unusual for webcomics platform because it's them, right? Yeah. So I'm willing to try and, like I said, figure out the kind of quirkiness of some of the UI as terms of following the story. And the other thing that's working in their favor is also because it's Stuart and Catherine Immonen, they're very good at knowing and utilizing the platform as it stands and whatever limitations the platform has to their creative benefit. And what I mean by that is they've clearly studied, as you go through the artwork and the storytelling, they've clearly studied, here's what a preview image looks like. Here's what the panel format should look like to match that preview image. Here's how big the fonts need to be read at various sizes on different platforms. Here's they've broken up the story in such a way that it's not, you see a lot of webcomics that, okay, here I've got my 3 or 4 panels per installment, or here I've got my 6 panels per installment, or one what would be a printed page per installment, or what have you. There's kind of a regularity to that. But what they've done is they're looking at the story chunks instead and saying, okay, here, these 3 panels are all we need to tell this part of the story. And then the next installment is, well, for this part of the story, we need 8 panels, and they'll, deliver that. So they're very conscious of the nuances and some of the limitations of the Instagram platform, and they're working to them, and they're not trying to creatively force their way around problems, or what could be problems, I guess, because of the platform.
Right. Yeah. Now that gets back to something that you had alluded to a little while ago, and that was my lack of awareness that there was more to this webcomic than I originally thought. And maybe we should warn readers about this, and maybe our listeners are much more attentive than I am and pay attention to things more. Because with not all, but okay, so basically, well, we didn't even say what the URL is. The URL of this webcomic is instagram.com/grass.of.parnassus, Parnassus. So there is where you go on Instagram to see this webcomic. So when you go to this page, at least as of now, and I think that they update this every Monday. So let's say this coming Monday, there'll be, 10 of these installments, because right now there are 9. The first one is the title page. Mm-hmm. And then after that, you have right now 8, what looks like 8 individual panels. And so, whether you're on a mobile device or a desktop, you click on the image and you get to see a larger version of it, not too large. And when I first looked at this webcomic, I thought that there were only 9 panels. It's like, well, okay, because this started back in September, so it hasn't been going on for very long. And I said, well, if they're doing it every Monday, there doesn't seem to be as much here, but okay, maybe they're a little slower. Little did I know, and you pointed this out to me, you informed me that with not all, but with most of these, what looks like single panels, there are other panels embedded in the posting. And so, for instance, the very first installment is an image of, a cliff at an ocean, and the words grass of Parnassus, this is Delaport, you're at 0 recall. Now, I thought that was all to that installment, but actually there's a little arrow that I missed within the panel itself, that if you click on that, then you go to the next panel within this installment. And again, it's kind of a close-up of the cliff with seagulls around it. And it reads, now 01, repeat, we are holding the front door. Light it up, now 03. And then you click that little arrow again, and you get a third panel within this installment. And what looks like the cliff kind of like shoots off like a rocket. And so what looked like only 1 panel is actually 3 in one installment. Mm-hmm. But I didn't notice that little arrow within these panels once I clicked them. And I don't know if I just wasn't looking closely or if I read it too quickly. I don't know. But just know that there's more to this webcomic than you could say meets the eye.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's and like I said, it's kind of a clunky UI, because the arrow that you need to click on to look at those 3 panels is on the right. But then once you've read that third panel and you want to go on to the next installment, you have to go use the back arrow, the larger back arrow, to go left to get to the more recent update. So you end up kind of having to shift back and forth, as both in terms of, you just can't quite click through. I think some of the ideal comics reading experience is you're either just running your finger through on your phone and scrolling through, or you're tapping or using your mouse to click through, click, 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 and you don't actually have to move it anywhere. You just hit the button and go on to the next installment. This, you have to go back and forth and side to side, depending on whether you're reading a second panel to the same installment or you're trying to go on to the next installment. It makes for an awkward reading experience, a little bit more interrupted than it needs to be, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess you could say that. And, I really do like the Eminence, and I don't want to say, well, they made a poor choice in terms of platform. Because, again, this may be a way for them to get more readers than they would if they, let's say, put up a webcomic in a more traditional way, like a blog.
Yeah. And this is I can almost tell you, I haven't talked to them certainly about this, but I can almost tell you the reason why they would have gone with this type of platform is the ease of use from the creator's perspective. Right. If they don't have to set up if they're doing this, they don't set up their own website. They don't have to set up their own web design. They don't have to the updates are kind of built in almost. It just from a creator's point of view, it's a lot, I think, easier process to just, okay, here's the next 3 updates, click, boom, and they're up. And, everybody can see them, it gets the alerts go out and the people can see it automatically in their feed if they're following them. So from a creative perspective, that's something that they can focus almost exclusively then on the story, on the creative aspect itself, and not fuss around with any of the other stuff.
Yeah. Good
so I totally see why they're doing that.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead.
Okay. Well, let's look at, we've been talking about the platform, their choice of using Instagram, and kind of the structure, the way that, the various panels are embedded in, if you want to call it that, in each of these uploads or installments. But let's talk about the story itself. Now, how would you describe what's going on in Grass of Parnassus? If you can.
Yeah. Well, I'll say first, again, we don't have a whole lot of content to work with at this point. So I'm not sure where the direction is that they're going with it. But essentially what happens is we have this, like you described the initial panels, we have this rocket ship shaped like a cliff taking off. There's a little bit of discussion about, with the, mission control, for lack of a better phrase or term. And then we zoom in, which I presume to be the interior of the ship. And I don't know if you read it that same way or not. And we have a couple of technicians or mechanics or something like that who are trying to figure out a problem with one of the pieces of equipment. And we don't have a full sense of, they don't go into the technical details of what this piece of equipment is or why it's not working. But they're, just 2 people hanging around, using tools, and here, pass me the wrench. And, and I had this weird dream last night, and, just kind of casual conversation as they're going about their business.
Kind of chit-chatting.
Yeah.
As they work.
Right. And eventually find, essentially like an alien kind of Cthulhu-looking creature in the middle of it. And obviously that seems to be a problem because is
that Dr. Ibrahim?
Yeah. Well, is later identified as Dr. Ibrahim, who is in fact not the problem itself, but he was possessed by, what did she call it? Let me see if I can get to this real quick here. Described it as a psychotropic oxide cat. is apparently the problem. And so she pulls the cat out of the Dr. Ibrahim's inside somehow, gets rid of the cat, and Dr. Ibrahim is then fine. And I don't know if they need to continue doing work on this mechanical thing or not. We haven't gotten to that point yet, but it sounds like, there still needs to be everything should be fine there. They just need to do a little bit of cleanup work. So that's about as far as we've gotten so far. So we don't know exactly what's going on, if this is just kind of a background or setting the mood and tone of the series, or if these are actually going to be the primary characters, and if so, what the full plot is.
Right. And, you did say something, I think, quite significant, in that we really don't have that much here to go by. So we don't know if some of these characters we see are going to be major figures that will carry the majority of the narrative, or, as you put it, what's going on here is maybe setting a context, setting a mood.
Right.
Before we get to the heart of the story. So, I have no idea how long this is going to be. It could be that the Eminents are just setting things up.
Yeah.
Over the past couple of months.
Yeah, I could easily see this. Just based on what I've read of their work before, this could just be a prelude type of situation that, we don't actually get to the main plot for another month or 2 or 3, and then carry on from there. I could easily see them doing that. They're both adept at using and setting tone and mood and establishing kind of doing a lot of, I guess, almost world building before you even get to the plot sometimes. So it's that neither of those things would surprise me if they wanted to go in that direction. But it's early days for the comic yet, so it's certainly hard to tell and put a definitive, hey, yeah, A+, this is great, fantastic, you're gonna love this story. But I like I kind of alluded to before, because it's the Imminence, I'm fairly confident they know what they're doing, and that this is going to be something that I will enjoy in the long term, whatever the story ends up being.
Yeah, true. And whatever it is, I guess we could definitely call it a sci-fi narrative.
Yes, definitely has a very sci-fi element to it. We've got some weird looking aliens, or alien-like creatures that appear to be friendly, but maybe not. I like the idea of this kind of harmless, normal-looking kitty cat that ends up being deathly a problem, across the board, and has, the ability to take over someone's consciousness. And there's a nice little bit in how the one technician, I don't think they're actually named at any point that I recall. But the one technician, when she is able to remove the cat, how she disposes of it and gets rid of it as a problem, I found that quite enjoyable too. And it kind of just goes to, again, setting the character, setting the mood, setting the tone, whether or not that cat is ultimately significant, or, that species of cat is ultimately significant. It speaks to the sci-fi element that, yeah, everything that you see might not be what you think it is, kind of thing. So I very much like that about it.
Yeah, I was not aware of this before you pointed it out to me, and it was always it was exciting to see that the Eminens are doing this webcomic. Now, I'm not aware of them doing any other webcomic, have they?
Yes and no. I know, well, I kind of say that hesitantly. I know they've posted stuff online in the past. Not recently, I don't think. It's probably been 10 years, maybe, possibly more. But as I recall, it was stuff that was very much intended to go out in print, and I don't remember the specific timing on whether they were just putting stuff online to use as a preview to sell the book, or they put it all online to develop it first and then sold the book later. So this certainly isn't the first time they've done something and posted their material online. But I don't know if I don't recall off the top of my head if that was specifically would have been considered a webcomic or just a preview to a print comic. Okay. And I mean, I'm totally drawing a blank on what the name of that particular story was too. It was something about, to my recollection, it was something to do with an art collector, and I believe they were trying to track down a thief who had stole a prized piece from a museum or something. Or, and as I recall, it was tied to some of the Nazis that looted museums and whatnot in the wake of World War II. And I'm drawing I'm drawing a blank on what the name of that was. Absolutely gorgeous, absolutely fascinating story, but one of those where that was kind of superficial backdrop. The more interesting stuff was the character definitions, and the people talking to one another was infinitely more interesting than whatever the superficial plot was.
Yeah. And who knows? I mean, maybe this is something that they will put into print when they're done.
That would not surprise me. There's one nice bit I noticed too. I don't know if you caught this or not. In I think it's the November 12th update, which is the third most recent one as we're sitting here talking.
That's the one that begins, "This is unexpected," with
yes.
Dr. Ibrahim's, one of his tentacles, I guess you could say, lashing out at the guy's arm.
Right. what I don't know if you caught this or not, but there's a 3-panel sequence there, but it's actually a giant single panel.
Yes,
and he's just got it drawn as like I said, he's got this square format that they're working in within Instagram, but he's set it up so that you can when it goes to print, which I think it would eventually, it would just be read as a single full width panel. Full width to the page. And I think that it kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier, is they're conscious of and know how the Instagram platform works and presents material. And I like that he's got it set up in such a way that it still can be read as 3 panels and you can still be read as a sequence, but he's got it broken up in just the precise way that it works in both directions. I think that's one of the things that I like about Stuart Immonen as an artist, is he's very conscious of, not only the illustration aspect of drawing comics, but the format and the layout and the structure of the page and the panels that he's working on. And that's something like this, I think, is barely noticeable unless you're looking for it online. So I have to assume that he's preparing this for a print publication as well at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, Sean, you want to move on to the next webcomic that we're going to be discussing on this episode?
Absolutely. Let's take a look at Lavender Jack
by Dan Schkade. And, when I saw the name Schkade, I thought, that is how you pronounce his name. And in fact, in one of those panels, one of the installments in Lavender Jack, he takes a break from, I can't remember where. It's it's a more recent installment of this webcomic.
Episode 19. I happen to have 19. It up at the moment.
Yeah, okay. So, yeah, he takes a break from the story just for, I guess, 1 week to, as himself, kind of introduce what he's done, what he's doing with Lavender Jack. It's kind of self-reflexive in a way, but he also goes through a series of questions that readers have had for him about him as well as the webcomic Lavender Jack. So he goes through and answers some of those questions. And the first question that he addresses is, how do you pronounce his last name, which is spelled Schkade, and he points out that it's like Scotty, but you kind of I guess not elongate, but what would you call it? You kind of slur, hiss, I guess.
Yeah.
So it's not Scotty, it's Schkade. Were you familiar with Schkade's work before Lavender Jack?
Not really. I started reading, as I started reading it, it was one of those where the art looked familiar and I couldn't quite place it. Mm-hmm. And I looked him up afterwards, after I read everything. I was like, he had worked on a Spirit series, I think maybe 3 or 4 years ago, and not one that I had read, but I remembered and kind of noted that it had come out. And he's got obviously a similar art style in that he does here. So I kind of knew, I'm kind of vaguely familiar with him, but not terribly.
Yeah. I know him from what you just mentioned, The Spirit. Several years ago, Dynamite, and I guess there's not a Spirit series going on right now with Dynamite, but it wouldn't surprise me if we see another one. But what they've been doing over the past several years is coming out with story arcs by different writers, different artists of Will Eisner's The Spirit. And the very first one that they came out with, Schkade did the art. And I specifically remembered that name. And I went back to the previous episode where we looked at that Spirit series. And lo and behold, it was the same artist. And I even remember when we posted that episode, Schkade, I guess it was on Twitter, responded that he really appreciated our comments on, his illustration work with the Spirit. And I think he even complimented us on getting his last name correct.
Well, it certainly helps now that he's got it flat out. Here's how you pronounce it. I think that helps too. I don't know if he had that at the time, but having it now certainly helped me.
Yeah. So yeah, this is, I really enjoyed this webcomic, and it's at Webtoons, and we've discussed a number of Webtoons comics in the past. Mm-hmm. And this is at webtoons.com, and I'm not going to give you the exact URL because one of the things I don't like about Webtoons is that each individual webcomics URL is a little convoluted. Part of it has the title, but there are a series of numbers. I'm not exactly sure why they do that. But the easiest way of finding Lavender Jack is going to webtoons.com and then doing a search on Lavender Jack. And there you will quickly find it. This is a webcomic that began relatively recently in June of this year. And it's a story of intrigue. And I guess it reminds me in some ways of the Scarlet Pimpernel, you could say.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, it takes place in, I guess, a fictional town called Gallery. And in fact, Schkade, in that one installment, number 19, where he addresses the reader, he tells us that he imagines Gallery being in Europe near Switzerland, Italy, and France, where the three countries kind of come together. So it's a little nation state, Gallery. And it is the story of, I guess, primarily a gentleman by the name of Sir Mimley and his assistant Ducky. Mm-hmm. And Mimley's other life is Lavender Jack. And Lavender Jack is going around and exposing a number of prominent citizens in Gallery. He does this. I think the first time we see this is with a really big landowner and builder by the name of Lady Lackshore. But we also find out that he's done this with a banker named Baton, industrialist called the Gerhardt sisters, and then another rich, prominent individual called Van Lund. And we come to find out, and this is not a spoiler, it's not giving anything away, that what all of these individuals have in common is that they had been a part of a now defunct group called the Inclement Investment Company. And the Lord Mayor was a part of this as well. And when the story first opens, we see that Lady Lackshore is terrorized, I guess you could say, by Lavender Jack. And when I say that he exposes these individuals, basically what he does is he shows their dirty side, right? He doesn't hurt them. He doesn't kill them, but he does show how corrupt they are and what they're into. So basically, he presents them as they really are, but they don't appear to the public. But he does this with Lady Lackshore, and Lady Lackshore afterwards bursts into the office of the Lord Mayor of Gallery and says, "You must do something about this character. He's terrorizing me. He's terrorized others like Baton, the Gerhardt sisters, and Van Lund. This won't stand." And so what the Lord Mayor does is he ends up calling a famous detective who is a hero of his. And this is a female detective by the name of Teresa Ferrier. And she's quite famous for solving cases. Mm-hmm. And so Ferrier and her wife, Marguerite de Melbourne, who I guess was an artist, but whose mental faculties are fading, they come to Gallery. They're hired to come to Gallery, or at least Ferrier is hired to come to Gallery and find and expose and solve the mystery of Lavender Jack, because Lavender Jack is this mystery. And by the way, when Sir Mimley appears as Lavender Jack, what he does is he puts on kind of a purple or lavender suit and wears, I guess you could call it a devil mask of some way.
Yeah.
In some way.
Mm-hmm.
so he won't be recognized. And also there's apparently some kind of device on the mask to mask his voice electronically.
Yeah.
So that's how he gets around. So Sir Memley is very athletic, very nimble, very athletic. And so he is able to elude capture, at least so far, where we are in the story, and is able to get away. And he is able to do what he does with the help of his female assistant, whom he calls Ducky.
Yeah. And you know what I want to point out here too is, not only is he exposing some of these high profile citizens, the way he is doing it is by breaking into their homes and breaking into their safes and secure areas and stealing a lot of their paperwork and then feeding that to the local newspaper. So it's not just like he's being a reporter and saying, hey, here's this information. He is confronting them directly in their own homes and taking the incriminating evidence right out in front of them, literally before their eyes in a lot of cases.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And so that is what he's doing throughout the story. One of the complications, though, is a character by the name of Lady Hawthorne. And then her husband, Lord Hawthorne, who comes into the narrative a little later on. Lady Hawthorne was, I guess, the leader of the Inclement Investment Company, and she likes to stay out of the public eye. She's the only one in this investment company that Lavender Jack hasn't confronted and exposed, even though she's probably the most corrupt because she's the leader of this group. Now, we don't know yet why Lavender Jack is specifically targeting the people who were a member of the Inclement Investment Company. And by the way, this is something that the detective Ferrier figures out. At one point, she's in the Lord Mayor's office, and the Lord Mayor has kind of as a, little remembrance piece, a photograph of all the members of the Inclement Investment Company. And it occurs to Ferrier that the people who have been terrorized and exposed, with the exception of Lady Hawthorne, are members of the Inclement Investment Company. And there's something about this exposure that really gets to Lady and Lord Hawthorne, because then they attempt to do their own, and I don't want to give anything away here, so I'll just say tidying up of the Inclement Investment Company. But we don't know why, okay? So we don't know why the Hawthorns are doing what they're doing. We don't know why Lavender Jack is specifically targeting people who had been a part of the Inclement Investment Company. That's one of the big mysteries.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that, or one of the things that I find interesting is that both Lavender Jack and Ferrier are both trying to essentially get to the same problem and get to the same solution, but from very different approaches. And so they're kind of working almost adversarially, but for the same purpose. Which I think makes for a very interesting storytelling dynamic and character dynamic.
Yeah, and you know that this will happen. I just don't know when. But Lavender Jack and Ferrier are probably going to join forces, or at least will get to a point where they realize that, as you point out, both of them have the same goal, but coming at it from different directions. Mm-hmm. You know what's going to happen, but you don't know when.
Yeah. And one of the things I seemed really, I don't know, that I was trying to think of a quick way of explaining this earlier. It's almost, I think the character of Ferrier brings to mind, and I think very deliberately so, the character of Sherlock Holmes. Right. Ferrier is clearly this master detective, and the reason why she's hired in the first place, I think you kind of mentioned earlier, is not only was she a hero of the mayor's, she was a hero because she was being written about in the pulps. And there were these stories about her adventures and about her cases. And there's some debate on how fictional they were and how factual they were. But she has, this long history of being a Sherlock Holmes type of investigative detective. And we get some allusions to later that she's well past her prime at this point. She's been doing this for like 40 years, and she's not really losing her faculties, but she's kind of fallen out of favor and maybe has.
Right, and she hasn't had a successful crime that she's solved in quite a long time.
Right. And then you compare this against the Lavender Jack, who's very, clearly described as a young man, very athletic. And, I think the Scarlet Pimpernel is a good analogy. There's a mention in the little intermission piece that Schkade did, comparing him to Spring-Heeled Jack. But what I think the closest analogy most readers would be familiar with would probably be more Batman. Particularly in the comparison or the analogy of Lavender Jack as, the wealthy socialite who goes out and is essentially dispensing justice, along with Ducky, who's acting as his kind of personal butler, very much like Batman and Alfred.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of that.
Yeah, and I think we've seen they've actually have written, Sherlock Holmes meets Batman stories before. But I think as I recall, those were interesting in and of themselves, just because, you've got these two kind of classic, iconic characters that are meeting for the first time. But from a storytelling perspective, I think this, being essentially the same type of story, is done a little bit better from a storytelling perspective. And that's just my personal thing. I think, if you're doing actually Sherlock Holmes and actually Batman, you've got some storytelling baggage that you have to deal with as well. Right. Not the least of which being, Sherlock Holmes was late 1800s, early 1900s, and Batman is clearly 1940s on. So there's kind of a timeline problem there.
That's never stopped DC or Marvel.
That's never stopped them before, but it's just just puts an interesting, kind of wrinkle on things. And also, you're trying to pull together these two characters from very different worlds. That doesn't always make sense. Alan Moore did a reasonably good job of that with League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, but, Batman works in a very different genre than Sherlock Holmes did. So I don't know that makes sense. But here in the Lavender Jack story, I think the characters are changed enough, right? This is not a direct Batman analogy here. This is a unique and standalone character in and of his own right.
Her own right.
Her own right.
Although, she does look like a guy because she's bald. And in fact, when I first saw her, when we first see her in this webcomic, I really thought it was a man, but they were referring to her in the female sense. So
yeah,
but yeah, it is a female.
Yeah, it's I don't want to say distracting, but it's certainly disarming, I guess, when you first read that, because you're right. She's very much drawn without a lot of the typical trappings of femininity. Right. She does wear a dress, but it's a fairly it's not a very overly flowing one. And her physical build is kind of large and wide. She looks like she ought to be a wrestler or something almost. Not a particularly large bust, usually dressed in suit coats. Like you said, bald. So there's not a lot of the typical trappings that you would see, particularly for an Edwardian character or an Edwardian feminine character. So yeah, it's easy to kind of get, I think and I'm sure that's done deliberately. But it ends up being a little disarming, I think, when you kind of see this character, and presented as a Sherlock Holmes character, And well, that's another thing too, is just the social norms. We've already established, by the time we see the character, we've already established that we're looking at a time period, from 100 plus years ago. Women typically were not in position of power of any sort, so I think there's some interesting things that he's doing and challenging the stereotypes of that time.
Mm-hmm. Now, we've talked a lot about Ferrier, but we haven't talked as much about Sir Mimley or Lavender Jack. And Lavender Jack, I mean, he is the standout figure here. He is the protagonist of this narrative. And I mean, I really do appreciate the way that Schkade works him into the story, because, I mean, you're right. Sir Mimley in many ways is like a Bruce Wayne type figure, wealthy socialite, also very athletic, adept, nimble, and is able to get in and out of various situations. Although at one point, Ferrier, in her own way, corners Lavender Jack, as he is escaping. It was during the, celebration.
That giant ball scene.
Yes, that they have in gallery every year. It's like an annual event. And so Lavender Jack is running away, and Ferrier corners him and basically, at least to some degree, kind of exposes not him, but one of his tricks. He has basically mastered microwave to where, and it's never explained how he does this, but he's able to use microwave in some way that by snapping his finger, he can make certain things that have an explosive quality to them explode, like a gun, like a bullet in a gun. And it is Ferrier who actually discovers this at the point that when she first confronts Lavender Jack. So, I mean, he is frustrated there, but for the most part, I think Lavender Jack is really adept at getting away and doing what he wants to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think that goes back to, the analogies with Scarlet Pimpernel and Spring-Heeled Jack and Batman. It's, there's a bit in one of the more recent episodes, I'm drawing a blank on which one, where there's a group of people are trying to figure out a group of socialites, right? Nobody in particular, extra knowledge or anything, are making their estimated guesses on.
Oh, the younger people.
Yeah, the younger people on who this Lavender Jack character is. Maybe not by name, but some people suggest he's a socialite. Others suggest that he's just some bum crawling out of the sewers. Others say it's all just a big prank. This is a big hoax perpetrated by the some of the wealthy in the town. And there's some variations on that. And then with each discussion point, they present an image of what their expectation of that character is. And they're all radically different versions of the character. In fact, he's actually, Schkade is brought in.
Episode 23, by the way.
Yeah, and he's actually brought in some other Webtoons artists to display, basically do fan art for him on that. Which I think goes back to that interesting analogy with Batman. There are any number of versions of Batman in the same way, right? There's the Adam West version, there's the Super Friends version, there's the Michael Keaton version, there's the Dark Knight Returns version, there's the Neil Adams, Denny O'Neil version. All of these are very different characters, realistically speaking. Those Batman, the Adam West Batman is far and away removed from, Chris Bale or something like that. So I think it's interesting that he's using that kind of notion of a character that's removed enough from society that he has his own mythology built up around him among the society itself. Right. So we don't have everybody says, we're as readers are seeing who Lavender Jack really is. And we're getting we're just now starting to get to kind of I don't know if you'd call it an origin per se, but the last couple of episodes have talked a little bit about that, about his past. So we're seeing who the character really is and how the Sir Mimsley character started taking up this mantle and whatnot. But I like that he's also, that Shanky is also showing us that not everybody sees him the same way, that we're seeing these versions of characters, and which makes for an interesting parallel as, because we have that with Ferrier in that, she's presented as here's this character, this detective and whatever, and she is repeatedly confronts the Lord Mayor on his interpretation of her as he read those stories about her. And it goes back to the basic plot for Lavender Jack himself as he's trying to expose these prominent figures in society for the corrupt individuals that they actually are, and that there's the presentation of here's the image that I show the public versus here's who I really am. And I think there's this notion of the dual identity that runs throughout the entire story for almost all of the characters, all of the major characters, which I find that very fascinating.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And there are a number of characters that we haven't even mentioned yet. And, that's one of the things that I really appreciate about Schkade's narrative is that he does populate this story quite well. So, for instance, there is the chief inspector of gallery whose name is Honorara Crabbe. And in some ways, her last name is kind of Dickensian because she does come across at times as a little crabby.
Oh yeah.
Although she, she is a positive character, right? She's a good character. She's the chief inspector, and she is a favorite of Lord Mayor. And so, what the Lord Mayor has assigned her to do is to have Crabbe accompany Ferrier around. And so basically they're solving the crime together, although, Ferrier does, most of the work in terms of figuring out. We also get a newspaper editor by the name of Abby Quarrel. And again, her name in certain ways is Dickensian, because what she publishes in the newspaper, at least according to some, is quite controversial. We learn fairly early on that she has, I guess, in some ways, kind of an investment in Lavender Jack because Lavender Jack's exploits and how he exposes the prominent citizens of Gallery sells papers. And so, of course, Abby Quarrel wants Lavender Jack to do what he does. He doesn't hurt anyone. He just exposes what he thinks needs to be exposed. And that exposure sells papers for Abby Quarrel. So she has a pretty good relationship with Lavender Jack, even though she doesn't know him.
Mm-hmm. Although, actually, and that's another interesting twist, is she actually does. Because
she doesn't know she does.
She doesn't know she does. But yeah, she has a relationship with Sir Mimsley. And the two of them are friendly with each other, have discussions with each other outside of the specifics of Lavender Jack and the news exploits and what have you. And that because of that, you see, that's why Mimsley is then feeding this one of the reasons why that Mimsley is feeding that information to her specifically and not through some other venue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I really enjoyed this webcomic, and it's something that I'd like to keep up with.
Yeah, same here. I really enjoyed that. I'm looking forward to reading more. This was one I was not able to read in one sitting because, just other commitments come up all in the middle of reading it, and it pissed me off every time that I had to put it down because, I had to go on to the next thing or do whatever errands, and I was like, no, damn it, I want to read the next part of this.
Okay, let's go ahead and move on to the last webcomic that we're going to be looking at for this episode, and this is a completed webcomic, relatively short, but interesting in a variety of ways, which we'll get to in a minute. And this is Take the A Train by both M. Dean and Z. Akhmetova. Now, if the title sounds familiar, well, then you are a fan of Duke Ellington and Billy Strayhorn, because that is probably one of their most famous songs, their jazz pieces. One of the reasons why we wanted to look at this as our already completed webcomic is that, and correct me if I'm wrong, but this is the first time that we've looked at a webcomic that is by two different creators, and each half is on their own website. So the first half, I guess, is the first half of Take the A Train. It could go any direction.
They can go either way,
right?
yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, I found out about it through M. Dean's website. And by the way, M. Dean's website is www.meedean.com. And to get to her half of this story, it's, medean.com/atrain. One word, ATRAIN. And then Akhmetova's half of this webcomic is at, I don't know if it's a he or a she. I'm not sure. I'm not familiar with this creator.
Me either.
It's at the website www.azakhm/take-the-a-train. A little more involved instead of just A Train. So, but if you go to one of their sites, they each provides a link to the other's half of the story.
Right.
And, as we mentioned, you can start with M. Dean or you could start with Akhmetova. It doesn't matter, because even though they're both parts of a complete webcomic, they are halves that do not depend upon the other in any way whatsoever. So M. Dean's half of Take the A Train takes place, I guess, during the early 1960s, whereas Akhmetova's half of Take the A Train takes place in 1941. We're actually given the year with Akhmetova's site.
Actually, we get the year with Dean's as well. It's 1957.
57. Oh, okay. Yeah. Huh. Where did I miss it?
I just saw it as you were talking about it. I totally missed it earlier.
Yes. Okay. It's on that second page, or the first page after the title page.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. It's not as apparent. And so that's something else I overlooked on this month's webcomics installments or pieces that we're looking at. So 1956. Okay. Yeah. Well, the reason I thought it was the early 1960s is that when M. Dean's protagonist, whose name is Marisol, goes to New York, she goes to a club, and the young people who are sitting at a table are talking about On the Road, and are talking about bebop jazz. Mm-hmm. It could be something out of the 1920s or early 1960s, but definitely during the 1950s.
Yeah,
as well. So 1957 and then 1941. My main point was that each of their halves doesn't rely on the other in order to understand what's going on. So you could read M. Dean's installment, which I think is about 8 pages?
Something like that, yes.
Yeah, and not refer to Akhmetova's at all in terms of understanding what M. Dean is doing, and then vice versa.
Yeah.
And it's the first time that we've looked at a webcomic like this.
Yeah, and then the interesting thing, I think, is that while both of them are tied to, the Strayhorn Ellington song and the notion of the jazz club in New York at the time, or roughly the time period of about a decade there, it's a totally different set of characters, right? Mm-hmm. So it's almost looking at the impact of that particular song over the course of 2 decades. Mm-hmm. And, you can look at that, as a reader, you can look at that either as, you can try and read that chronologically and, read the Akhmetova's version first as it occurs earlier, and then see where that goes. Or you can look at it on seeing, read Dean's version and seeing kind of here's the kind of the continuum of the story itself, or of the song and of the that type of jazz more broadly. And you can see that as here's this kind of like, here's a string of jazz that carries through essentially American history. We've only got a small nugget of it here with the 2 installments. But I think it's valid. It would be a valid approach to do another version, say in 1980s or something as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but one thing though that the two halves of the story have in common is, well, one thing is it deals with younger people, right? Mm-hmm. Now, in as I mentioned, in M. Dean's version, the protagonist is a young girl by the name of Marisol. In Akhmetova's half, his protagonist is a younger individual. I mean, this is a young boy whose name is Leopold or Leo. And both of them end up at the Savoy, which is the place where Duke Ellington used to play. Okay. So It becomes almost a mecca for both of them. Now, in Akhmetova's half of the story, we have Leo. When we first see him, he's in a group of individuals. He kind of retreats to his own to read a book, and I guess a woman, I don't think it's his mother, from the party says, "Why did you leave the party?" Not that he's necessarily a loner. Then but he wants to be by himself during this party. Then we see him with, I guess, his family, and then his father, I'm assuming, is going into New York with a friend named Billy. Uncle Billy. And I'm wondering if Uncle Billy is Billy Strayhorn.
Oh, you know what? I totally missed that.
It seems to be the case. Now, I can't recall. It's been a long time since I've seen an image of Billy Strayhorn, but Uncle Billy, as he's called, looks to be an African-American. He has a little thin mustache, and he's wearing a hat, and they're taking him into the city, and of course, they're going to the Savoy. So Billy going to the Savoy, which is the place that Duke Ellington made famous. It could be Billy Strayhorn. I don't know. But Leo is fascinated by Duke Ellington. And so when he goes into the Savoy and the band's playing, he is like almost mesmerized, because this last panel, we see him kind of standing. He's holding his hat in his hand, and we get musical notes that are kind of flowing into him. Mm-hmm. And so we get the sense that this is impactful in certain ways.
Sure.
And we have something similar going on with M. Dean's version. And in fact, her protagonist, Marisol, is, I guess, almost a fanatic about Duke Ellington, to the point that at one point, I think she says in Spanish, and I'm going to talk to you about that, she wants to marry him. She's that infatuated with Duke Ellington. Now, one of the things that's striking about M. Dean's half of the story that takes place, as you point out, in 1957, is that at least half of this comic is in Spanish.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
What did you do you speak Spanish?
I took some classes in high school, so I kind of vaguely know bits and pieces, but certainly not fluent.
No. Yeah, I do not speak Spanish. I did not take any Spanish classes. I opted for French. And so one of the things that I did was that, I read it through without really understanding much of the text, although I could, to some loose degree, get a sense of what was going on, kind of through the visuals, but not completely. Mm-hmm. But I went back and reread it with Google Translate. And what I did was I just typed the dialogue into Google Translate to get a sense of what the various characters are saying. And when the story begins, we see Marisol at home, and I can't remember if it's her mother or her grandmother, probably her mother, who's getting on her case. saying that, you're infatuated with this jazz stuff. You're wasting your time. You should go out and get a job. You should get married. You should be doing something with your life. But no, what are you doing? You're just fantasizing about this jazz. The jazz is going to ruin you. And so her mother, I guess, and even her sister, I think, is berating her, for her obsession with Duke Ellington. And so Marisol decides to go to New York. She gets on a bus and ends up in New York and is wandering the village. I guess it's not Harlem, is it? Or is it? Because of the one club she goes in, it does seem something more Greenwich Village-ish.
Yeah, I don't think it actually says at any point. Well, no, wait, she does. She claims it's Harlem.
Okay, so maybe
she does make the explanation that it's Harlem, but I don't know if it actually is or not.
Okay, and I would guess that the Savoy is in Harlem.
I
am not up on my jazz history as probably I should be. But so anyway, she goes into this one club, and there are these young people here, and she says, "Hola, everyone. I'm Marisol. Do any of you like Duke Ellington?" And these young people look up at her in kind of a disbelieving way, and they accuse her of being old school. And in fact, one person even says, "Have you ever heard of Miles Davis?" She says, "Yes, but you don't dance to Miles Davis." So she's definitely anchored in an earlier era. She wanders out of the club and eventually finds the Savoy, and then she becomes mesmerized. In fact, M. Dean's last panel is similar in many ways to Akhmetova's, in that you see the protagonist, the young individual who is in the panel by itself, although you don't see musical notes flowing into Marisol, but you see kind of an ecstatic look on her face, one of satisfaction. She has her eyes closed, inside the Savoy. So she feels that she has found her Mecca, right? This is the place that she belongs. And not that other club where the people are talking about Miles Davis.
Yeah. Yeah. But even though we don't have those musical notes, when she walks in the couple of panels before, we can see literally the band starting up and the conductor starting, okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, and starting off. So even though you don't have that same kind of visual impact of the music flowing into her, you can at least assume that if it's not actually flowing into her now, it will be in a second.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Another thing that's striking about Take the A Train, and you can say this with both halves together or each half by itself, it's a narrative that doesn't really go anywhere. And what I mean by that is, you do have a story, right? So you do have these young people who are fascinated by Duke Ellington and jazz, and who eventually make their way to the Savoy. And that's basically the story of each one. Outside of that, there's really no conclusion outside of that last panel of each half, where you have the protagonists kind of taking in the music in one way or another. So it seems in many ways kind of like an ambiguous or open-ended narrative, both if you take both halves and put them together, but even if you look at each half by itself, each has an ambiguous, almost incomplete ending.
I don't know that I fully agree with that, honestly. I don't know that it's huge. It's not like a huge plot or conclusion in that sense. But in both cases, we have two individuals who are very dedicated and interested in jazz more generally, but then also the Take the A Train song in particular, and that style of jazz, maybe Duke Ellington in particular. There's actually, I think the Akhmetova's version, there's when the young boy realizes he's going to the Savoy with the others, his eyes just pop open. It's like, wait, is Duke going to be there? And that kind of thing. And then we end with both of them having some, not hardships per se, but what's the word I'm looking for? They encounter some, I don't know if disdain is not really the right word, but they're kind of derided. They're mocked a little bit for having this interest.
Especially Marisol.
As particularly Marisol, yeah. But to a lesser degree in both stories. But then once they do get to the Savoy, once they are able to get that music, all of that doesn't matter.
Yeah, it's
right?
like they're in their element.
They're in their element. They found their mecca, to use your words, right? And I think you could argue that the thematic story for that is, something along the lines of follow your passions, right? It's worth it. It's worth the derision. It's worth the, getting bumped around by other strangers in an environment you're not familiar with to get to that thing you love. And if that is one particular song, if that's one particular style of music, whatever it is, you should follow that to its conclusion. And it's worth putting up with the indignities and putting up with some of the derision, the mocking, and what have you, to get to that thing you love.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And you make a good point. You're reading these as a little more complete and less ambiguous than I am. And I think one of the things that led me to say that is each of these installments, each of these halves are really short, right?
Right.
And again, there's nothing wrong with that, but it just leaves me with a sense that these are brief snapshots in, let's say, Marisol and Leopold's life, especially as it relates to the Savoy. And it just seems like there may be or should be a little more there, but there doesn't have to be. I'm familiar with the work of M. Dean. She has I don't know if you're familiar with it. She has a new book that came out not too long ago called I Am Young, which is made up of a variety of short stories or short pieces, and that all have to do in one way or another with music, particularly with the Beatles. And in fact, I think the main storyline that is peppered throughout I Am Young does concern this couple whose relationship in many ways is based on the Beatles. And in fact, last week, Sturge and I discussed that book, among others, recent books that deal with the Beatles. Our special Beatles episode, which is good. You ought to listen to it if you haven't yet. It was fun. But yeah, M. Dean, she doesn't do long form comics. So it makes sense that this, 8-panel short piece, it is kind of representative of the kind of comics that she does. So yeah, I'm familiar with M. Dean's work and the fact that she does a lot of shorter comics. Now, I'm not sure if the same can be said for Z. Akhmetova. The only other time that I think I've been familiar with, and perhaps you as well, with Akhmetova's work is back in July of last year, you and I looked at Akhmetova's webcomic Gods Can't Die. That may be longer form. On Akhmetova's website, you can find their shorter comics. And so maybe Akhmetova privileges shorter form narrative, although maybe with Gods Can't Die, that's going to be something that eventually will be longer narrative.
Yeah, that's it's definitely longer than the 8 pages or so we have here.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Yeah, definitely a lot longer than that, but still wouldn't. Whether or not you describe that as long form is, I guess, depends on a little bit on how you define long. It's definitely longer. But certainly not one of those 3,000 page graphic novels or something like that.
Right. Yeah, but it's a fascinating webcomic, both each half by itself, but more importantly, Akhmetova and M. Dean's, Z. Akhmetova and M. Dean's halves brought together, take the A train. So it is something very different. Another thing that strikes me about this being different is I'm looking at the webcomics that we're looking at this month, and we get a variety of different presentations, right? I guess the most traditional webcomic presentation is Dean and Akhmetova's Take the A Train. Although, given the fact that each half is hosted on each of the creators' site, it's something very different. We haven't really looked at anything like that.
Yeah.
With Lavender Jack on Webtoons, we have one of these webcomics, and we've talked about this phenomenon before, where instead of going from page to page to page, you scroll down. And that's primarily how you get the narrative. Of course, that's the way the Webtoon's set up.
Right.
And then with Grass of Parnassus, we have something completely different. We have a webcomic that is being hosted on Instagram, which we've never looked at before.
Right.
So we've got three very different ways of presenting webcomics in this month's episode.
And not just very different, but very different from, not just different from each other, but different from what you would typically find, I think, as a webcomic, just generally. I think that's speaks to the fact that, this technology is still being experimented with. We see a lot of people who use a similar type of format with the, clicking through page to page, installment to installment, little buttons underneath or on the sides that link you all the way back to the beginning or to the previous one. These are not any of that. And I think that speaks to the fact that this technology, the web technology, just generally speaking, is still moving forward. It's not static by any means. And I think people are still experimenting and playing around with what they can do.
Yeah, and along with that, it just demonstrates that what people may normally think of as webcomics is maybe more static than dynamic, and it doesn't reflect the kind of experimentations that are going on out there. It's one thing to say that, someone is housing a webcomic on Tumblr, which is a social networking site,
Right.
That's different from something like a blog, although Tumblr in many ways is structured like a blog. But then you get something very different like Webtoons, where the emphasis is kind of like study group in some ways, kind of scrolling down in order to get the gist of the story and then going from page to page after you scroll down. You scroll down one really long page and then you go to the next. But then you have something like the Eminence on Instagram, which, I wouldn't think of searching for a webcomic on Instagram, but hey, there you go. They've chosen that as their platform.
Yeah.
So, there are different creators who are doing different things on different platforms with different structures in trying to get their visual webcomic stories out there.
Yeah. And more power to them. I don't know, that's one of the great things about this is that maybe not every experiment is as successful as any other one, but people are still playing around with the form and the format and the delivery. And there's, I think, good to be had from any version of that. Even if it's not successful in and of itself, it can show you why something is not successful. And you can think about, okay, well, when I do my thing, I'm going to do it a little bit different because it didn't work there. Mm-hmm.
Well, three webcomics, very different, one from the other, and very different from most of the things we usually look at, as you point out.
Yeah.
That we discussed this month, our kind of late November episode. We started off with Stuart and Catherine Eminen's Grass of Parnassus. After that, we looked at Dan Schkade's Lavender Jack. And then we wrapped up with Deanand Z Akhmetova's Take the A Train. So three really fascinating stories.
Absolutely.
Yeah. In not only in terms of content, but also presentation, as we pointed out.
Yeah. Yeah. A lot of good stuff there. A lot to learn from everybody, I think.
That's right. And if you want to find great comics, you wouldn't go wrong by checking out the website of our sponsor, which is Discount Comic Book Service. Or if you prefer your comics in digital format, then visit their sister company, mydigitalcomics.com. So that's dcbservice.com and mydigitalcomics.com. And after you do get your comics there, get in touch with us and let us know what you're going to be reading. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message online via SpeakPipe. Or you can call us the old-fashioned way. Pick up that phone and dial 415-3-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
And, of course, email is certainly always a way to get a hold of us as well. Great if you're trying to let us know about some webcomic you'd like us to check out and take a look at. You can reach us at TWOGUYS, TWOGUIS, at comicsalternative.com. And you can email me directly at Sean at comicsalternative.com. That's SEAN at comicsalternative.com.
Or you can contact me directly. I'm Derek at comicsalternative.com. You can also find us all over social media. We have accounts on Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, YouTube, Slack, and Discord. You can subscribe to the podcast through Apple Podcasts. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on Spotify, on Google Podcast, on TuneIn, and on iHeartRadio. But you can find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as the reviews and comics-related commentary that we post on our blog, simply by going to our website, which is, again, comicsalternative.com.
I'm getting a theme here from that. I should anything you're looking for all your comicsalternative.com needs, go to comicsalternative.com.
That's right. So yeah, now Sean and I will be back later this month for our, I hope on time, December webcomics episode. So look out for that later in this month. Until then, I'm Derek.
And I'm Sean, and we'll talk again soon.